Amen. You can go ahead and have a seat. Good morning. It's great to be with you this morning. One of my favorite things to read is Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin and Hobbes is a daily comic strip by the American cartoonist Bill Watterson, ran for about 10 years, from 85 to 95. And if you're not familiar with this, if you've missed it, it is a classic in the same vein that the Beatles are a classic. And so I would highly recommend it. There's a little, even some good theology there as well, but that's really not why you read it. It's just funny. But it kind of reminds me of someone. Her name was Linda. She was also a lover of Calvin and Hobbes, and she was a strong, independent young woman. Linda was the middle-ish of three brothers, and she grew up in a very male-dominant home, and therefore she learned to be self-reliant. She learned to be able to handle herself. She played even wide receiver on her high school football team in the Midwest. This was one tough gal. And so it didn't surprise anyone when she decided she was going to kind of branch out and leave the Midwest and go to school in Seattle, Washington. And no one was really surprised when on a whim she called home and said, we have this month coming up and this college break. We get the month of January off. We get Christmas and then January off. And she said, I'm going to come home for the holidays, but I'm going to take the month of January and I'm going to, in the vein of Calvin and Hobbes, I'm going to the Yukon. And she told him she's going to drive up to a little town called Whitehorse up in the Yukon just for the fun of it. And of course, you know, this was Linda. There's nothing her parents could say or do, and she just decided to go on and do it. And so she piled everything in her little Civic right after Christmas, and she began to drive up, starting in Seattle, through Vancouver, Prince George. I don't know if you're familiar with Canada at all. I'm really not. But the Yukon is right next to Alaska. It is out in the middle of literally nowhere. And she did fine until the roads got very icy and the visibility extremely limited. She was used to seeing snow, but she was used to kind of America highways and roadways where things were kind of cleaned up, and this was not true. And she wasn't used to the total white flurries of snow as it was coming down, where it made it almost impossible to see many feet in front of her. And she made it about 6 hours from Whitehorse to a little town called Watson Lake, and was really relieved just to get that far. And she knew she had a mountain range between her and Whitehorse, and was wondering if she was going to make the rest of the trip. She got a good night's rest, and the next morning she found herself eating breakfast seated near two truckers. And being really the only ones there, they began to strike up a conversation, and they asked her what she was doing, and she said that she was driving up to Whitehorse. And they looked out in the parking lot. There was only one car out there. It's this little Civic. And they said, you're driving a Whitehorse in that thing? And she said, well, yeah. And she said, did you know it's a little dangerous this time of year in this kind of weather? And she, being the independent woman that she was, said, well, she had to try. She was determined to do her best. And so they said, you know what, we're just going to have to hug you. And she was like, you ain't touching me. And they're like, no, it's not like that. He said, for us, he said, a hug is when we put one truck in front of you and one truck behind you, because we're going up that way, and we'll get you to Whitehorse. And so she took them up on their offer, and though it wasn't an easy drive, it was definitely easier. And she got to Whitehorse. She even delayed coming back a day because they said they were coming back through not 2 days later, but 3 days later. And they did the same thing going back. Needless to say, when they finally did get to a point when she didn't need them, they stopped and had a small meal. She actually did hug them goodbye. by God's grace. Linda was a strong, independent woman who didn't need anyone else except when she did. The topic of dependence is a tough one and an interesting one. I often kind of, in my research and trying to get a handle on a subject, I'll Google something and try to see what comes up and whatnot. And so I did as I normally do. I Googled, I put into my Google search, importance of being dependent on others. The importance of being dependent on others. I didn't get a single hit. I got titles like Dependent Personality Disorder. How to Overcome Emotional Dependency. 8 important reasons why you should be more independent. The importance of being independent. Why you should never depend on anyone but yourself. Becoming emotionally self-reliant. Stop depending on others for approval. How to stop looking for happiness in others and learn to create it. In at least the first 2 or 3 pages, not a single article said, hey, dependence is a good thing. It's not usually considered a positive thing. And there is, you have to be careful of codependency and being overly dependent on someone. But there are times when you don't have a choice. And then there are times when God doesn't want us to be. As a matter of fact, that's the way life is lived. And the Israelites, as we kind of follow them through the promised land, they find themselves in this situation as they're traveling through the desert on their way to the promised land. And that's what we're going to look at today in Exodus chapter 17, for there is a challenge that presents themselves. Now, if you remember, we're following the Israelites. They had a good beginning in the beginning of Exodus. God did some amazing things. He brought them through the Red Sea, all through with the promise that he's going to take them to the quote-unquote promised land. The land described as filled with milk and honey, 2 luxuries, by the way. It is the ultimate, if you would, retirement. It is a thing you want to brag about, if you would. Look at my home. Look at where I live. But between where they were and where they hoped to go, there is this desert. And last week we talked about the initial challenge with their own appetite and how they got themselves in trouble then. And now comes the second challenge. Right after God has provided the second time water for them, picking up where we left off last week in verse 8 of Exodus chapter 17. It says this, the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands. So here is the challenge. First of all, there's something you should know about the Amalekites. Amalekite was the grandson of Esau. So those of you who are familiar with the Bible, there are 2 sons that are born, Jacob and Esau. Jacob's the younger, and there's this struggle constantly in their life between the two. It is a classic sibling rivalry. And though it kind of works out in the end between them, it never really does. As a matter of fact, this is much of the tension that you still see in the world between the Jews and those around them kind of played out. And it was that kind of tension between these families, and they kind of knew each other. And it's interesting that the first real enemy that they find, other than themselves, is folks who kind of know them. They're a nomadic group, and they actually partly live by attacking other populated groups and plundering their wealth. They had domesticated the camel, and they used its swiftness effectively in surprise attacks. And we're told in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 and 18, that what they actually did was they waited for the Israelites to be strung out, and then they kind of cut in the middle. So they were strategic. They knew what they were doing. However, the Israelites didn't. And Moses calls, here it says, on Joshua. Now, it doesn't give us any context of why they chose Joshua. I could guess, and it's just a guess, that maybe back in Egypt, Joshua served under, he was a slave, but he served under maybe a military commander. Maybe he, rather than making the bricks and moving them around. His job was to move all the military equipment around. And maybe he had watched the soldiers trained or something. It doesn't tell us, but Moses chooses Joshua. And you see here, it says to him, go choose some of our men. Notice it doesn't say, go gather our army. They had no army. No one had fighting experience. As a matter of fact, the Egyptians made sure that no one had fighting experience. The only reason, if you remember, that they had weapons at all is because in that mad dash of them leaving, the Egyptians were willing to give them anything. But they didn't know how to use them. They didn't know how to use them. And so Moses calls Joshua and says, hey, Joshua, I got this plan. We got these few weapons and maybe some farm implements. I don't know what they had. He said, I want you to go out and, just choose some good guys because we're going to battle. Now, from Joshua's perspective, you can imagine this is kind of crazy. But they don't really have a choice. And it doesn't tell us what went on, but he had to go out to the peoples and say, okay, give me somebody who looks me maybe and who's strong. And you've seen the action movies, right? They go out, they put together the unit of misfits, right? I imagine in my memory, my imagination was something like that. I don't know. But he gets these folks together. And Moses, and here's Moses' encouragement. Listen, this is what I'm going to do for you. He doesn't give him a plan. He doesn't say, hey, dig a trench or flank them on the right or nothing. He says, I'm going to stand on the hill with the staff. Thanks, Moses. Appreciate the vote of confidence. Now, he was obviously communicating a little bit more than that. The staff represented the presence of God in their midst. But as far as Joshua was concerned, he couldn't, what, is he going to part the sand? What's he going to? And as a matter of fact, he didn't even tell Joshua that, he didn't say anything about a play. He said, you're going to go fight. That's why I want you to pick so we're going to go fight. That's the challenge that lays before them. An impossible challenge, if you would. And then we get the solution, starting in verse 10. It says, so Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning, but whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. So interesting enough, the solution has three parts to it. And it's easy to forget the first one. The first part is, Joshua and his men went out to fight. Didn't matter if the other two things happened. If Joshua hadn't, by faith, gone out and said, okay, this is all I got. It ain't much, but we're going to trust God. We're going to trust his plan in this. They wouldn't have had a victory. Secondly, Moses prayed, beseeched God for victory. He showed their dependence by lifting up the staff. And third, Aaron and Hur had to support Moses. Now, God could have done this any way he wanted to. We've seen him do multiple things. They never had to fight Pharaoh's army. That was the Red Sea deal. So we know that they didn't have to lift up arms to do anything. But God specifically chose to do it this way. He specifically asked Joshua, this young man, this soon-to-be warrior, this really his first testing as a warrior, to just trust. Though he was outnumbered, he was outclassed. He only had, even as it was, half the tribes, if you would, to even choose from, because the other half were on the other side. They couldn't communicate. He had to trust. He had to have faith. Now, I'll give you a little glimpse. We're all talking about, the whole series is about entering into the promised land. Joshua ends up to be only one of two people that really does enter the promised land. Think about that. And it starts with this, as far as we know, first time he shows up in the story, it starts with this act of faith. Real hard work, his life on the line. But he had to do something, and it had to be out on the edge. The second was Moses had to also kind of believe. I mean, like I say, they didn't strategize. There was no, as far as we know, there's no military. I'm sure they had some strategy plan, but I don't know if Moses was involved or not. All the scriptures tell us is that Moses knew that he had to go stand before God. And it wasn't, for whatever reason, it wasn't good enough. He didn't just stand there with the staff. He raised it up. It's a symbol of like lifting your hands up sometimes when you're worshiping God. It's not the stance. You can worship God with your hands down, but there's something about lifting your hands up sometimes that opens yourself up more to Him, that helps you focus more on Him. It's a posture of prayer. It's also, by the way, a posture of dependence. And that was the posture that God had chosen. Now, the Bible says that at the end, that Moses, even in his old age, he's about 80 at this time, and he lived many, many years to at least 120 or so after this. He said he died a strong man, so it wasn't a matter of strength. It was just a matter of you can only hold your hands up so long. I don't know about you, but I can last maybe about one song before I have to give myself a little break, you know. Maybe I'll just cradle the baby a little bit before I go back up to, yeah. But Moses, this is all day long, and so his arms begin to get tired. And so he does what I do. He goes to rest a little bit. I'm sure he doesn't stop communicating with God. I'm sure he doesn't stop caring about what's happening. But the moment that he does that, a moment as he doesn't lose complete focus, but a little less, if you would say, the army starts not to do so well. And then as soon as he gets his, and I don't know how many times this happened before they realized what was happening. It's not like as soon as he put his hands down, they're like, oh, no, don't do that, Moses. It was just like, they're just watching the natural flow of things. That's the thing. God didn't tell them this was going to happen with his arms. They just discovered this. The more dependent you are, Moses, the more we have success, and the less success. And so it's evident that prayer needs to happen. The problem is, his arms are getting tired. And you can only will for so long. And so they devise this plan, the third thing. Aaron and Hur devise this plan. They get a rock for Moses to sit on. Probably because they figure if they just stand there and hold on each side, then they all have their hands up. And they're all going to get tired. But if he sits down and his hands are up, it's about, I don't know, shoulder height. The Bible doesn't say exactly how it happened, but my guess is they just kind of use their shoulders. So all they had to do was stand there rather than supporting it themselves. Imagine someone sitting with their hands up, they're about the same height. And they help support the staff. And again, it didn't have to happen this way. God could have given Moses easily supernatural strength to keep his arms up the whole day. That would have been nothing. And the stories of the Bible, it would have just been another one. But God specifically chose to show and to use the folks, if you would, another act of dependence, leaning on Aaron and Hur. Now, I don't know about you, but I have my own issues to wanting to be fiercely independent. It is part of human nature. It is ingrained through us in our American society. And then, on top of that, it's my personality. And then, to top it all off, I blame it on my heroes, which are cowboys. Right? I mean, Clint Eastwood here, I think I have a picture of Clint. Right? This is not a positive example, so that's why I didn't use John Wayne. I'm going to pick on Clint. But as I was growing up, cowboys were my heroes. And my dad had a country radio station, and I was surrounded by I lived in Wyoming initially, and so I was surrounded by cowboys. And this image of them being tough, courageous, the loner, self-sufficient, protector of the weak. They weren't themselves weak. They protected the weak. They were hardened. And that kind of played into my own sense of self, of ultimately, I wanted to be a modern day cowboy. Self-sufficient. However, even the Lone Ranger had Tonto. We're actually designed for this. There's a guy by the name of William Broyles. In his book he wrote called A Brother in Arms, he says this, the quote will come up for you. He says, "A part of me loved war. Now, don't get me wrong," he says, "I'm a peace-loving man, fond of people and animals. In my view, war should have no place in the affairs of men." But then he reflects on his experience of Vietnam, and then he writes this: "The camaraderie our platoon experienced in that war provides an enduring and moving memory for me," he writes. "A comrade in war you can trust with anything because you regularly trust him with your life. In war, individual possessions and advantages count for nothing. The group, the unit, the platoon is everything. In war, we regularly risked our lives to recover our wounded or even our dead. We often felt close enough to call each other brother. A part of me loved war." Now, he didn't really love war. He loved the fellowship and the camaraderie of the platoon. He found a life that he was thirsty for that came into the form of deep dependence on others. And you see this all over the place. You see young men and women getting involved in gangs. They don't like gangs. They never liked the violence. But there was a sense of family, of belonging, of friendship, of community there. So God could have won this battle in a myriad of ways, but in his infinite wisdom, he chose a path that required this kind of dependence that we really do need. An action where success was dependent on God showing up, but dependence on God is shown through prayer and dependence on others for support. And then he gives them what I'm calling the marker. This is a really interesting conclusion, if you would, to this particular narrative. In Exodus chapter 17, starting now at verse 14, it says this: "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." So Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." It really means it's like a rallying cry, if you would. He said, "For hands were lifted up to the throne of the Lord," that's the prayer, "and the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." The interesting thing is once again, you remember when they had the situation in Egypt where God delivered them. That was the first time he said, "I want you to remember this." Now that was significantly different because that was every single year on this date. Remember, remember, remember. And we talked about how that ultimately led to Christ. He wanted to remember that because he was preparing them for Christ. But this is the second time. Now, this isn't a necessarily every year kind of thing, but he says, make sure, Moses, to write this one down, because I want you to remember this. There's something important here. Now, if you're a follower of God, anytime he stops and says, hey, remember this, you probably should take note. Something, he's emphasizing it. It's important. Tells them to remember. And there's several reasons why. First of all, remembering will help encourage the people later when they find themselves again in an impossible situation. We talked about this again a couple weeks ago when we talked about the importance of the Passover and now for us communion, how important it is to remember, because life is a series of ups and downs. And it's amazing how short our memory gets in the downs that we forget the ups. We forget God's faithfulness. And so he says, Moses, write this down because there's going to be some downs. They're going to meet an impossible situation. By the way, they're going to come to the brink of the promised land itself, and they're going to see in an impossible situation. And you know what they remember? They remember their slavery and how they were never faced with that impossible situation in slavery. And they forget everything in between. How many times do we do that? The second thing is, and this is really interesting, he says specifically, make sure Joshua reads this. Now, Joshua is the faithful one. And you know, if you continue to read in the story, Joshua, by the way, like I said, is one of two. Caleb's the other one, who gets to enter the promised land. And there's a particular battle early on. The first one God pretty much does for them. Jericho, the walls come tumbling down. But the second one, actually, they initially lose because of sin in the camp, if you would. But they go back and they win. But interesting enough, they win because Joshua has a javelin, a long like spear. And he basically does the same thing in the beginning of the battle. And it's completely different, and there's more strategy. You could tell they've learned some lessons by now. But he refuses to lower that javelin until the battle is won. It's the only time that he does that. But you could see that it was important for Joshua to remember God's goodness. So as they went into impossible situations, God said, I want faithful ones. God has given his word because we're going to face some impossible situations. And he had it written down for you and I so we won't forget. And if you don't remember, you will be overwhelmed. You will be overwhelmed. It's interesting that in the New Testament, it says that God's word is the sword of the Spirit. It's the sword of the Spirit. If you don't know God's word, you're fighting without a sword. The third thing is, it became a symbol of God's faithfulness to his people that they may rally to him. So that's that God is my banner idea. It became a kind of a remember the Alamo. If you're familiar with, again, another one of the great Western stories of just a little over 100 men who bunkered down in a mission and stood up against the great army coming against them. And though every single one of them was killed and wiped out, it was because of their fight and because of what they were willing to do that allowed Texas to kind of fight them off. And we have the United States as we know it today. And it was that rallying cry. And he was like, I want you to remember this because this is going to be the rallying cry, if you would. I want there to be a remember the Amalekites. Remember what God did. And we know it was God because we were outclassed, outnumbered. We know it was God because when Moses had the symbol of God up and we could see it going, we were one. And when he didn't, we know it was God. Because we sent two people up with Moses. He didn't go alone. And they were there to help him. It was also a reminder of God's decree and judgment on the Amalekites. He wanted them to remember, this is what I declare. And there's a reason why I've declared it. I think for a lot of us too, we struggle with issues of right and wrong because we've forgotten why God in the first place said, that's not my way. And we begin to kind of trust our own independent instincts on things. And we forget that it's not a rule because God just likes rules. And it's not a rule because, the church just can't get out of whatever century. It's there because God really loves his people. He really loves people, period. And it's really there to protect them. It's really out of love. But if you don't remember, if you don't understand the banner, his word, you miss that. And so that brings us to what I'm calling our response. You want to enter the promised land. And remember, when I'm talking about the promised land, for you and I, it's that abundant life that Christ is talking about. When he says, I didn't just come to give them life, I came to them to give them life abundantly. And you want that. You don't want just the same old, same old. You want life abundantly. Here's the challenge. Our response needs to be dependence. And this, by the way, this trips up people all the time in all kinds of walks of life. They're trying to change something in their life. And a lot of times the biggest stumbling stone is dependence. Ask anyone who's got familiarity with the 12-step program, right? Once people finally hit their bottom, they're like, man, I need to change. They come in and they say, you know what? You need to believe in a power greater than yourself. Oh, got that one. Turn it over to him. Okay, I'll do that. And then they get to the steps 4, 5, and 6, where all of a sudden they have to give their garbage and trust it with somebody else and be honest about it. For most people, they're done for a while till they hit their 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th bottom. And they finally say, this is no way to live at all. And they're kind of like Joshua's, forced into the battle, if you would. Many folks have said, man, I want to lose weight. I want to save money. I want to treat my kids differently. I want to love my wife better. But they keep getting the same results, which is the same insanity as before. Why? Because they keep trying to do it themselves. So the first step is to pray. I don't know the first step, but a step is to pray. Prayer is a posture of dependence. Oftentimes we treat prayer as our Christmas list to Santa. That's wrong. It's not. Go through the prayers in the Bible. It's rarely that. What it is a posture of dependence, saying, I lack, you don't. By the way, if you read a lot of the prayers start out with complaints. God, how come you let the enemy do this? God, how come you let the unrighteous prosper? God, how could you? God, how could you? God, how could you? And then in that process of processing with God, it's like, but I know you are good. We sing that. And for some of us, when we were singing that, it was by faith, because right now things don't seem so good. But if you remember, which the psalmists do many times in their prayer, but God, I know you're good. And I know it just to change a situation is nothing for you. And so I choose to trust. I choose to wait. I choose to depend on you and your plan. And then amazing things happen. Prayer is an acknowledgement that God is our victory. Not making more money. Not finding that one special person. Not the economy turning around. Not finding the job that I love. God is our victory. He'll use a lot of those things, but those things are not the victory. God is our victory. And in the end, all those things perish. In the end, everything goes back to the worms or back to inheritance to somebody who will abuse it and lose it. But one thing will remain. Your love for, your relationship, and your victory through God, through Christ our Lord. Prayer is not about, hey, God, would you bless my battle plan? Prayer is not about, God, would you make sure my life works out this way? Prayer is about laying hold of God's highest willingness. Prayer really is about, God, what is your plan in this? Now, I'd like to see this happen, but what is your plan? It's both a request and a yielding. It's about dependence. And many of us lack the power and the excitement and the passion of a spirit-filled, changed life because we still think it's about God helping us do it our way rather than depending on Him. And if you want to know where you're at, just look at your prayer life. Now, by the way, we all feel guilty here. We all could pray more. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Right, so I understand this gets us all. I don't want to bring you to a place of guilt. I want to just bring you to a place of take one more step. Just one more step. God will meet you right where you're at. You don't need a 3-hour prayer life. Right? Matter of fact, you've heard me talk before. It's much better to treat prayer like a teenager on their cell phone. A little bit all throughout the day. But it's an act of dependence. Number 2, find a personal community of spiritual encouragement. Just like Aaron and Ur came alongside Moses. George Gallup, he's a famous pollster, points out that Americans are physically detached from each other. Some of our brothers and sisters from other countries that enjoy communal churches kind of see that here. We change places of residence frequently. Most of us do not know even the names of our neighbors, even the cubicle next to us oftentimes. There's kind of isolation even in a teeming city. Matter of fact, the more people there are in a town, the lonelier it gets. One of the central needs of our time is intimate and healing community, he writes. American men, even more than women necessarily, need a community, small group. Society trains us to be loners, and we bottle up too much inside, and we lack power. Remember I talked about the idea of the cowboy? Well, one of the singing cowboys of my day was called Garth Brooks. And he sang a song called Standing Outside the Fire. And there's a stanza in the song that says this. He says, we call them strong. He's talking about the image of the tough and rough cowboy. We call them strong, those who can face this world alone, who seem to get by on their own, those who will never take the fall. We call them weak, those who are unable to resist the slightest chance love might exist, and for that forsake it all. But he says we got a backgrounds. In the chorus, he says, standing outside the fire, standing outside the fire. Think of the fire of being what the Bible says, the Holy Spirit. Life is not tried, it is merely survived if you're standing outside the fire. Now, there are problems with codependency. Absolutely. But that's why I love this image of Moses. Moses had to hold up the staff. It wasn't Aaron and Ur saying, you know what, God will bless us. They'll bless the soldiers. We just got to stand back. And it wasn't Aaron and Ur coming and saying, Moses, just give me the staff. Yo, man, we'll do this. No, that would be the wrong kind of dependency. It was them standing arm in arm, supporting each other. Words of encouragement. Soldiers in the field back to back. That's the kind of dependence we're talking about. Not you do it for me. Not I can't do nothing. I'm sure glad you're here. No. It's everybody with their hands on the boulder doing their part. No one left below saying, well, you're just too small and no one's too insignificant. As a matter of fact, that's the way God works. This used to drive me crazy, by the way, about my dad. He was a good dad. I didn't know at the time. I know it now. But Dad used to do, whatever I needed. If I needed like money for a car or something like that, Dad would assess what I needed. He would assess how much I had, and then he would determine what he was going to give. So let's put it this way. Let's say the car was $6,000. I know it's hard to believe, but let's say it's $6,000. And Dad could determine that I had and could raise about $2,500. Now you'd think my dad would give me $35. He didn't. He gave me $33. Because he always wanted me to stretch just a little bit more. Now it used to drive me nuts, but I also have a lazy side. That really helped. It didn't cure it, but it helped. And this is what I found out about God. God can make a rock where the whole entire village, minus a 6-year-old, would roll. But he purposely doesn't. He purposely designs the rock sometimes so that it requires a 6-year-old. He purposely designs a church so that we need everybody that's here to do something, to do their part. He purposely designs it that way. So we'll grow and have abundant lives. So we'll get inside the fire, as uncomfortable as it is. Too many of us are just surviving, wondering why we can't cross over to God's abundance. And it's because we are just surviving. I don't have time for a small group. I don't that whole touchy-feely thing. And it's when I tried that and the people, gossiped or it just wasn't it wasn't this, it wasn't that, it wasn't, I'm not even going to argue with you. Probably, that was probably true. But that's still how God forms us. Trust him. Be wise in who you choose to trust, but trust him. Get a sponsor. However that looks for you. It doesn't have to be a small group. I would encourage you to get into something. Maybe it is a small group. It's not too late, by the way, to join small groups. There's a list out there. Grab the list. Get involved. But it doesn't have to be that. But it does need to be a brother and sister in arms. Somebody that you're clashing swords with. It's got to be word centered. It can't be just two people who hang out and love to watch football together. That can be part of it. That can be part of it. But if you don't start talking about, like in the recovery, if you don't start talking about the big book, the AA book or the NA book or whatever book, there's no recovery. You don't start talking about the book and holding each other accountable and praying for one another and supporting one another in those things that matter, it's always going to elude you. The last thing is, here's my challenge for you. Make a personal, what I'm calling God is great timeline from your life. First, obviously, get familiar with what he's done, because it'll give you a pattern for what he's going to do in your life. But also keep track of what he's done in your life. Keep track of it so that when you hit those times, when you're tempted to run, when you're like, I just can't do it no more. God, I cannot get over this wall. You can remember, oh, wait a second, I said that before. I said that, but I can't tell you how many times I do this for my kids right now. I'm their memory. Actually, Mom does better than I do, but I do a little bit too. Where they're like, Dad, I can't do this class, or this relationship that just, I'm done. No one will ever love me again, or whatever it may be. And say, wait a second. Remember when we had this discussion before? And that's understandable. They're learning that. But way too often as adults, we stop doing that. And so my challenge to you is, seriously, sit down, get out a pen. I know this will take some time. I know some of you aren't into writing. That's fine. But however it is you remember, you want to make a video of encouragement to yourself. You want to send yourself emails whenever something happens. A God is great email when God does wonderful things throughout the day. However it is, do something. Have a folder on your computer, on your phone. I don't care how you do it, but do something. Remember that God is great. Because here's the thing. The situation, the Amalekites in your life will show up, and they're going to wait for you to be strung out. They're going to wait specifically for the time when you're weak, you're tired. Maybe God did something amazing then, but it's been a little while since you've seen him show up, and they're going to show up, and it's going to seem overwhelming. And your first response, at least my first response is, God, what are you thinking? I don't need this right now. And you will stay there, and you will try to handle it yourself if you don't remember. And that's when you need to take out, whether it's a journal, your phone, whatever it is, and remember that God is great. Now, I want to encourage you by just sharing with you a short video. 2 weeks ago, we asked y'all to remember how your story, the before and after. Remember writing on slips of paper? And so we took some of those. We didn't have time to take all of them. We took some of those, and we just want to share that with you and encourage you as you think about doing that in your own life, continuing and building on that right now, that God is great. Check this out.